Thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited to present today. I'm going to be talking about annual forage options for Wisconsin. You're going to see that a lot of the things that I'm going to bring up are actually very complementary to the presentation that Dr. Luis Ferreto just did. So let's get started. So similar to Luis, I'm going to start my presentation talking a little bit about a survey that I did as part of my extension appointment. I wanted to understand a little bit better what are some of the forages that are being grown in the state. So I sent out a survey to get a needs assessment. One of the questions that I asked was, what forage crops do you manage? And asking for crop consultants and farmers to mark all that apply. You're going to see no surprise here. A lot of people growing silage, corn, and alfalfa. But interestingly, a lot of individuals are growing also warm season annuals and small grains for cover crops and for forages. So when we think about this, one of the aspects that I wanted to think about is we know that the Midwest has a very large population of dairy cows. And when we look at the hay production, which is this graph right in the center, we see here in the blue line, this is all the hay production state, followed by alfalfa hay and other hay. So these are all the other crops that are being grown for hay production. So there has been an increase in interest in production of other forages that are not alfalfa and corn. And there's also a lot of interest in having this small grains as cover crops as well. So this is something that Luis just mentioned and that I'm going to bring up constantly in this presentation and others, is that typically what we're trying to do when we're feeding animals is we're trying to fit what the animal needs with what the forage is offering. So this graph here is a very good summary of the animal categories that's on the right here, and then all the different forages in groups. So legumes, cool season grasses, cool season perennial grasses, tropical annual grasses. I'm going to talk a little bit about why is it that the cool season grasses and the tropical annual grasses, they have this separation in terms of digestibility. So when we think about annual cool season grasses, some of you might know them as cereal grains, small grains. We're talking about rye, triticale, barley, wheat, oat. They can be separated into different groups. So there's the winter cool season grasses that they need a vernalization process to produce their flowers. So basically you plant that in the fall, they overwinter, so they accumulate cool temperature hours. And then spring and summer, they flower. And then we can also have the spring cool season grasses. So they don't require this vernalization, this cool period to produce their flowers. So that is mostly dictated by day length. And then within these groups, we also have early maturing and late maturing groups. So that is different within each one of those groups among the various types of rye, of triticale. Some of them mature early, so they will produce their seed head early on in the season, and some of them mature later, so they will remain vegetative for a longer period of time. So all of these plants are called what is a C3 plant, and this refers to the photosynthesis mechanism. So the photosynthesis, just to review some of our high school classes, is the process where CO2 is captured from the atmosphere by the plant, and it's transformed into carbohydrates, fiber. They're stored. If they get a nitrogen added to them later on, they will become a protein. So all these plants here are C3 plants. Now, what does that mean? Basically, they get their name because there is an enzyme that reacts with CO2. That enzyme is called rubisco. And the first time when that enzyme in the plant captures the CO2 from the atmosphere, it produces a compound, a structure that has 3 carbons. So that's why they're called C3 plants. Now, we know that all enzymes in the world, they are a type of protein. So it's no surprise that rubisco, which is an enzyme, it's also a protein, and it makes up almost 40%, so close to half of the soluble proteins in C3 plants. And they stay in the mesophyll cells in the forages. So that's basically the juicy part of the leaf blades. That's where they stay. One thing that we should know about this enzyme is that it reacts to CO2, but also with oxygen in the atmosphere. So there's a little bit of a competition there. So it's not a super efficient enzyme per se. So this is just a cross-section picture in the microscope of how a C3 leaf plant looks like. So we can see here that these are the mesophyll cells. This is where the majority of all that rubisco, all those enzymes are. One thing that I will note here is that there are these two bundle sheets. That's the vascular tissue for the leaf. So typically that vascular tissue has kind of a bit of structural fiber in it. So the more you have of those, the less digestible a plant is. So C4 grasses, which are warm season annual grasses, they're also warm season perennials. But we're talking about pearl millet, sorghum, and corn. Corn is also C4 grass. And they have a little bit of a different system. So they have this other enzyme called PAP carboxylase, and that enzyme only reacts with CO2. So it's a very, very efficient enzyme. And that enzyme captures CO2 from the atmosphere and transforms it into a 4-carbon structure. So those plants are called C4 plants. And what that enzyme does is it really increases the CO2 concentration inside the leaf. So basically, the rubisco, which exists on the C3 plants, in the C3 plants is reacting with CO2 and oxygen. In the C4 plants, because it has this other enzyme, it really reacts a lot more with CO2. So the rubisco works in a much more efficient way in the C4 grasses. It also has a lot of more of this bundle sheet. So this also have a lot more structural fiber. And for that reason, typically the C4 grasses, they are more efficient in capturing CO2 in producing biomass than C3, especially when temperatures are higher. So they're more nitrogen use efficiency, more water use efficient. And because these enzymes are so much more efficient in the C4 grasses, then we know also that it needs less enzymes. So typically the C4, the warm season annual grasses, they have less protein compared to the C3 plants. So this is just a picture showing light intensity and temperature on the C4 and C3 grasses. This is just to show that at the same temperature here, or same light intensity, the C4 grass does a lot more photosynthesis, so produces a lot more. And same thing at temperatures. At higher temperatures, the warm season grasses, the C4 produce a lot more biomass. So again, this doesn't mean that it's not an adequate forage. It just means that we need to match that forage to the adequate animal category to maximize production. So we've heard a little bit about pearl millet. We know that pearl millet is a warm season grass, so it needs quite a high temperature in terms of the soil in order to really establish well. It's very, very drought tolerant. It can produce quite a bit of biomass. Because it is so efficient in growth, it reacts a lot to nitrogen fertilizer. And the crude protein is a little bit lower than in other forages, so 12 to 14%. One of the challenges with these warm season grasses is that oftentimes they have very thick stems, so it can be difficult to go through the process of drying them for hay. So we need to pay attention on that. But another thing that I wanted to bring up, again, this is something that from last year we've learned after we had a drought, that C4 grasses tend to be a lot more efficient with less water available. All right. The other warm season annual forage is sorghum. Again, being a warm season grass, it needs quite a bit of temperature in the soil in order to grow, so 60 to 65 Fahrenheit. Again, not very high crude protein, but a lot of biomass production. One thing that I wanted to bring up is that we do know that it can cause prussic acid poisoning on animals. This is a substance that basically reacts with the oxygen in the blood of the animal, so the animal can die very quickly from basically asphyxiation. So there are some new cultivars, new types in the market that are prussic acid free, but if you're not using one of those, then please note that typically that prussic acid production is associated with the stress of the plant. So drought, frost, cold, herbicide stress sometimes can cause an increase in prussic acid. And also there are some concerns about nitrate poisoning, and that's something that can happen particularly when we have nitrogen fertilizer application during drought. So when we're thinking about this perennial cool warm season grasses, this graph here is showing the dry matter production of perennial cool season pasture. So I'm not going to talk about pastures today because we're going to be talking about this in the next seminar next week. But typically they can be a very good alternative, particularly for the summers. So to produce biomass during that period where pastures are producing less. Okay, now moving on to the annual cool season grasses, I wanted to bring up some studies that show the potential. As Dr. Ferretta just mentioned, we said that there is a lot of potential to use. We need to know more about it. So this study here was looking at fall and spring harvest of cool season annual grasses that need vernalization. So basically what was done was winter wheat, rye, and triticale were planted in August. And then those annual grasses overwintered. They were harvested in the fall before the winter, and then they were allowed to grow in the following spring, and they were harvested at boot stage. And the questions were, what will the fall yield be at the different dates? So if you do a harvest in the fall, if you delay that, how would that affect production? And if that was going to affect production in the spring harvest. So this graph here is showing the production of the fall harvest here. There was not really a lot of effect of the date. It was more a year-to-year variation. And as we delayed the harvest in the fall, there was a reduction in crude protein. Now, when we look at the spring in the following year harvest, one thing that was very clear is that the spring harvest was a lot greater than the fall harvest. When we look at the different plant species, so again, these were all winter cereals, so they all needed vernalization. There was not a very, very clear trend. There was some advantage over having wheat, winter wheat in terms of production. And the next study that I wanted to show is about oats. So same thing, it was, this did not need vernalization, so a little bit different. And we have early, intermediate, and late maturing oats. Kevin, I had 18 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I did the math wrong here. I apologize.
No, it's fine. I have 13 minutes on my watch.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. All right. So they use 3 different types of oats: early, intermediate, and late maturing oats, planted at 2 times, in spring or in summer. And they were harvested 11 weeks later. So again, the late maturing oats are the ones that take a lot to produce the seed head. So they have a lot more vegetative material. And they wanted to know how will planting harvesting time affect the production and nutritive value? And will the type of maturing, early to late, would that affect production and nutritive value? So what they found was that whether they were early, intermediate, or late maturing types of oats, there was no effect on yield. But what they realized is that if you plant earlier, so in the spring to harvest in the summer, the production was greater than if you plant later in the summer and harvested in the fall. In addition, in terms of crude protein, what was very clear is that independent on when you plant, the later maturing, so the plants that have more vegetative material, they will always have more crude protein. And very similarly, in terms of digestibility, these plants, if they're late maturing, so they have more vegetative material, they're going to be more digestible. The last study that I wanted to show is this one looking at winter triticale. So this is going to complement really well for what Luis just presented. So in this study, the triticale was established in September. So it was a winter cereal. So it vernalized during the winter, and then it was harvested in the spring. And the idea was to have a cover crop while also being able to do a double crop. So you will harvest in the spring, that would allow you to grow something else during the growing season after that. All right. So this graph here is showing the dry matter yield on the y-axis. And then this triticale was harvested at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different timings. It was either harvested at stem elongation, so more vegetative, or it was allowed to grow all the way to soft dough. All right, so the more to the right, the more mature the plant is. So no surprise, the more mature the plant is, the more biomass there is. But when we are going to look at feeding this to animals, one of the most important things is how digestible are they, right? So this is on the same studies, it is in a separate publication. They were looking at digestibility of MDF, which we already know is very important for animal performance, especially for lactating cows. So again, what we see here is 3 different levels or different lengths of digestibility for the study. So we have a lot of data for people who like the 24, the 30, or the 48 hours time of incubation. But what we see here is that as we delay the harvest towards more mature forage, more mature triticale, then the digestibility of the fiber is reduced. And if you harvest it earlier, then the digestibility can be very high. So there is basically this trade-off between production and digestibility, production and crude protein, that we kind of need to balance when we're looking at feeding this to animals. So the take-home message is, what we're going to try to do always is match animal requirement to the forage options that we have. Again, some of the different species have inherently a lower nutritive value, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you cannot have that in your system. It just means that you're going to match that to the correct animal category. So we know that warm season grasses, generally speaking, they produce a lot of biomass. They're super efficient, but they have a lower nutritive value compared to cool season grasses. And there are trade-offs between production and nutritive value. So when we're looking at this, we're always going to try and balance both of those. And also, and this is going to be on your chat, this is one of the links that I wanted to share. Kevin, who is the MC for today, and me and a bunch of other wonderful extension specialists have worked on a publication looking at growing successful late fall, early summer forages. So this is going to show up on your chat. So if you were looking for more information, you can check it out, or you can contact us. So my email is right here. I'll be happy to talk to you if you have any questions. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today.